And I don't know. I don't have the answers to that. But I do know God's a good God. And I do know that he is with you in these trials. And I do know that if we step into it and we allow it, he will teach us some things about ourselves, definitely teach us some things about him. And we have an opportunity at that moment to either grow in our relationship with him or fall away from our relationship with him. So what I'm going to talk to you guys, honestly, is what I learned during that time. I can tell you that the first thing I learned in that time was that there is power in it. And when I step back and I look now, my friend laughs at me. Amy is the one sitting here. She's the one that always laughs at me. My friend laughs at me because I used to not be a crier, and now I am a crier. I used to be very an extrovert, and I never met a stranger, but I couldn't even tell you their names when I walked away from them. And I always was a little bit separate from people. I mean, I moved to California, I went to Kansas City, and when I would leave those places, I never stayed in touch with anybody. I would just move on. And when God took me through this season, that part of my life just shifted. And one of the things that I learned in that period of time is that everybody goes through something. Everybody has a story. Everybody has pain. If you have never gone through something, you will go through something. There was someone that once said, you were either in the middle of your tragedy, just came out of your tragedy, or about to go into your tragedy. Everybody is going to go through something. And the other thing that became very apparent to me is that one person's tragedy isn't worse or better than another person's, because they are all designed to either draw you closer to God or pull you away from God. There's no middle ground. I mean, Jesus said it when the Pharisees were questioning him. He said, and they said, what's the most important commandment? He said, love your Father with all your heart, soul, mind, and spirit. And then the second commandment was to love your neighbors as you love yourself. And when you know that and you put everything in context that happens in the world around that, you begin to see things very differently. So I remember I have talked to people that have said, oh, I didn't have cancer, just this happened. In my heart, I say, no, that's not it. Don't discount the pain that you're feeling. Don't discount what God or the enemy is putting you through, because it's all designed to either draw us closer or draw us away. And everyone's looks different. And when you begin to see people in that light, you begin to understand the heartache that people feel. And you begin to understand those vulnerable moments that they have. They may come out as being ugly or rude or indifferent, but it's all coming from a place in their heart that's hurting. And that's one of the lessons that I learned very strong when I first started this. The other lesson I learned is that there's fear in the heartache. That when you are in a situation and the wind gets knocked out of you, how many of you here, and I'm not asking you to share your story, but how many of you here have either faced a heartache or a tragedy, or you know someone that has faced a heartache or a tragedy? How many of you? Every single one of you raised your hand. There is power in that tragedy. That's a lesson that I learned. And the reason why I say that it's a lesson that I learned is that, like my notes, so I don't have to wear my glasses. I wrote them real big. Tragedy has a way of consuming you. It can knock the wind out of you so strong that you don't even know if you can get up anymore. It can bring you to your knees so easily. It's like your world just goes whoosh when you get news or when something happens. And you begin to move into this place of fear, of pain. You begin to get very isolated. I'll walk you through kind of when I first got my news, and in the first few, I don't know, weeks, I had no idea how long it was. But I can remember the doctors giving me the news. And I called my husband. He was the first person I called. I was actually driving home from work when it happened. And I called him, and then I called my boss, and then I called my friend. And they were the only ones that I told. And I remember driving home thinking, what am I going to say? I've got 2 little girls at home. One of them is 9, and one of them is 12. What am I going to say? Are they going to see it on my face? I remember just thinking, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. No one wants to hear the C word coming out of their doctor's mouth. And it was like I was having to remind myself, breathe, breathe, breathe. Oh, God, don't let them see it on my face. Please don't let them see it on my face, because I didn't know how to tell them or what to tell them. Got home. Tom and I, luckily, I don't know where the girls were. It was in the summertime. It was interesting because when the doctor told me, it was a Wednesday, and she said, I can either see you Friday or Monday. And I said, Friday. And then when I got home and I talked to Tom, I realized that Friday was my 9-year-old's birthday. She was 8 at the time, and she was about to turn 9. And I'm like, I can't not have her birthday party. So I called the doctor back, and we rescheduled it for that Monday. Went into work the next day, told my HR manager, and then we all sat down, and I told my staff. And after I told them, I went back into my office, and I sat there, and I thought, breathe. Just breathe. I didn't want to go out of the office. I didn't want anyone coming in. I wanted to be left alone because I didn't know how to process it. And one of my staff members walked in, and she told me, go home. And I said, I can't. My daughters are there. They don't know. And I don't want them to see it on my face. She said, go to church. And I thought, well, that's a great idea. Why did I think of that? So I got in my car, and I drove to my church. And it was in Fenton at the time. And I walked in, and there was nobody there. The church was open. You were allowed to go in, and there was nobody there. And I was thinking, oh, God, I need to talk to somebody. I just need to talk to someone. How do I process this? And I could feel myself going like this and going down and down and down. And I knew that wasn't where God wanted me. I knew that wasn't how. I knew I had enough of foundation in my faith to know that wasn't what he had. But the fear was beginning to build up inside of me. And I went inside the church. I sat in a pew toward the front, and I cried. I laid down. Fell asleep, actually. Woke up, had no idea how long I was there. Got up, still nobody there. And I walked outside. And I ran into Pastor Pat Krebs. That's his wife sitting there, Sue Krebs. And I told him, he and I were on a board together, the school board actually. And I told him, he knew that I was going in for tests. And rather than, oh, I'm so sorry, and getting lost with me in it, he took me by the shoulders and he said, God has you. And he started saying all these Bible verses to me. And he started telling me, you've got to get into the Word, you've got to get into the Word. And it was like he grabbed me by the shoulder and he pulled me out. And he was beginning to speak life in me, and I'm like, he's right, that's what I have to do. And it was that moment when I was spiraling that he pulled me up out of it. So I cleaned up my face, went home, felt a little better, but could feel it coming back, And the next day was my daughter's birthday. So I woke up, forgot something for the birthday party, I think it was candles, ended up going to a dollar store to get candles on the way. Have you ever been in a situation where you were among people, but you could feel this glass bubble around you? You could feel like you were so isolated, and you could scream, and the people on the other side of that glass wall couldn't hear you. Have you ever felt like that? That's where I was. And I remember walking in and seeing somebody that I knew and thinking, oh, God, don't let them see me, don't let them see me, don't let them see me. And they saw me. Hi, how are you doing? And I'm like, I'm doing great. How are you doing? I'm dying inside. Yes, I'm doing fine. Talked to them, went on to the party. And I remember in that party speaking, and the noise and the loud, and if you can't cup your hands over your ears, that's what everything sounded like to me. It was like I was literally encapsulated, and I was smiling at people, and I was laughing, and I was like, don't you understand? You know, because they would say, how are you doing? What's been going on? Oh, nothing. And inside, I was just dying. And I knew that was not what God had planned for me. But it was like I couldn't pull myself out of it. And then Tom and I ended up finally going to the doctor the next day. And I don't know what it was. It was a combination of Pastor Pat sending me the Bible verses and a conversation of sitting down with the doctor and talking about the diagnosis and next steps. And for whatever reason, in that moment, it switched a little bit for me. And I went into, and those of you that know me, I can go into work mode pretty easy. I went into work mode. And it was like it flipped. And okay, now I know what I got to do. You know what? And I told, and she said, you've got it in both breasts. We need to operate. And I said, I'm not married to these. They can go. And she laughed, and she said, okay. She was aggressive like I was aggressive. And I said, and luckily my husband was sitting there, and he was saying okay too. And so it was like it shifted for me at that point. Mind you, though, there were a lot of times in and out of that period of time where I could still feel myself being pulled in. And I can tell you now, looking back on it, the level of spiritual warfare that was going on in my heart, in my mind, in my spirit was unbelievable at that time. And God knew that was what was going to be happening. Everybody that goes through it goes through that warfare. We don't think it's warfare. We see ourselves separate from it. We see it as circumstances. But I can tell you it is warfare. And God makes a way for us to get through it. But we've got to be willing to listen. We can't just go through the motions. And I will say this too, and I'm not saying this about me or anything else, but it's something that I've noticed with people when I speak to them. What is it that you focus on? When you think of your day and you think of the circumstances and you think of people around you, do you see the things that didn't go right, or do you see the things that do go right? Because in this moment, the character that you have becomes exaggerated. You either see that there is hope or you see that there is doom. And one of the things about God's Word, and one of the things about what we are supposed to do in the Bible, is He is supposed to be able to transform our minds. That's what the Word speaks about. And that's why it is so important to get into the Word, because He begins to transform your mind. And you don't even realize it until you're at that moment when you're having to say, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. This is what's good and this is what's bad. And where do you live your life? And you'll see that when you begin to transform your mind, you don't live it on the bad side anymore. All of a sudden, you're over here and you don't even know how you got there. You're just there because that's what the Word does for you. It transforms your mind. And I don't mean to be sounding like I'm preaching, because I know all of you sitting in here understand that. But I have to tell you that in that moment, I saw it in action. I saw God's Word coming alive, and I never even knew I knew it. And there was so much beauty in that. The other thing that was one of the things that became very obvious to me is the power of community. You know, the Word talks about the fact that we need to commune with each other. And I can tell you that what the enemy does in times like that, he is like a snake, and he will wind around you in fear. And if you give into it, he gets tighter. And if you get into it, he gets tighter. And he gets tighter. And that's what the enemy does. He's like a snake that goes around you. But God intended for us to have community around us too. And I can tell you in those moments when things were low, my community was beautiful. It started with Pat. You have to tell him thank you for me. Other things that I wrote them down because I didn't want to forget anybody. In that season, I had friends that were praying for me. And there were times when I was so sick and lying in bed, and all of a sudden, it was like I could feel his wings wrap around me. And it wasn't anything I was doing. I wasn't praying. I wasn't asking. I was just laying there. And I knew that people were praying for me in that moment. You cannot tell me that prayer does not work. And you cannot tell me that you can't feel it. So I am telling you now, and I am pleading with you, when you are going through something, let people know. Their prayers for you are carried on wings, and it will surround you. Trust me in that. I can tell you, it was like there were times I was walking with my feet off the ground. I didn't deserve it. I wasn't even asking for it, but my community was, and they were praying for it. I grabbed this because there was this saying that was said that I absolutely love. It says, a friend hears a song in your heart and sings it to you when your memory fails. And there is truth to that. And there was one friend that I had named Amy who exemplified that role more than anybody. It didn't matter where I was, what was going on. She sang the song in my heart because she knew me. And she knew in those moments when I wasn't me. And she would bring me back around by her words. When I had to cut my hair off, I chose to cut my hair. Once again, take charge. Not going to watch it fall out. So, you had a few things of chemo. Started getting in the shower thinking this is not going to work. So I decided to have my friend over that shaved my head. Can I tell you that I had more fear in that than in losing the girls? And I can tell you, and I remember looking back on it thinking, why is that? It's because that was more my identity, because I always had a lot of hair, not a lot of the other stuff. And so that was where my identity was. And so to lose my identity was very fearful for me. But I made the decision. I called my friend, come over with me. Called her back, don't come over. Called her back, come over. Called her back, don't come over. She ignored me, she came over. And she sat on the floor behind me with her legs Indian style as my other friend, sat in the bathroom and she cut my hair. Tom stayed downstairs. One of my girls was on the bed, didn't want to be in the room, but wanted to be there while I cut my hair. And I remember praying very hard to the Lord, I know I'm being silly about this, God. I know in the whole scheme of things it's just hair. But let me see this through your eyes. Give me peace about this. And when I looked up in the mirror and I saw my shaved head, I went, oh, not a bad head. And I never bothered me after that. And I know that was an answer to prayer. It didn't bother me seeing it all over the ground. I actually looked very, very good with short hair. But that's how God stepped in. She was the song in my heart. The other thing that I remember is in the hospital. My two sisters came up from Mississippi. They drove 8 and 10 hours just to be there. They weren't there when the surgery happened, and Tom couldn't stay with me after the surgery because we had 2 small girls. And I remember lying in bed and opening my eyes and seeing the 2 of them there. Both of them, my twin was she's in a wheelchair, and my sister was in a regular chair, and they're like, just laid out because it's in the middle of the night. And I remember just opening my eyes and seeing them and feeling peace, closing my eyes and going back to sleep. And I wake up again and I'd still see them in the same positions, drooling out of their mouths, sound asleep, and just chuckling inside. But it felt peaceful to me. I felt safe because they were there with me. I remember another thing that happened. People started coming out of the woodwork bringing us food. And I remember Sue coming over with this giant laundry basket filled with food. By this time I was home. The girls were gone. I had tubes all over me. Those drainage tubes which are very nasty. And she brought in this giant basket filled with snack food. It wasn't anything cooked. It wasn't anything else, but it was snack food. And that tickled me so much. And it was such a blessing because I had no appetite. I didn't want to cook for the kids. They were honoring me by not having smells in the house. And it just served such a purpose. And it was just every time you walked out and you see this giant laundry basket filled with all this food, it just made me laugh. And it made me happy because somebody was thinking about me. Martine. She came over. She brought me 2 books. This was right afterwards. I remember this very well. And one of them was a Catherine Coleman book. And I would sit outside. This was in June. I would sit outside with the tubes, everything, reading this Catherine Coleman book. And I became voracious with it. It was like I couldn't read. They were short stories. They were all the little stories of different people that she had touched. It was a journalist that had followed her through to basically try to debunk her. And what he was finding out with all these people was that these stories were true. And so as much energy as I could muster, I would read this story. And it was a story of faith. And then I would read the next one. It was a story of faith. And even though I had a faith, there was some powerful things in that moment reading these stories of how God had showed up for people that was encouraging my faith. It was making my faith grow. And I wasn't saying, yeah, but what about the people that didn't? There was something very sweet and very intimate in reading those stories. And I will forever be grateful that you introduced me to Catherine Coleman, because I didn't know her before then. I grew up Baptist. And it was my foundation for my faith, and I am so thankful that I had it. But it did not flow in the Spirit. And so all of that was relatively new to me. I'd only been experiencing that for a few years. So to read this woman so powerful blew my mind. It was beautiful to me, and I just absorbed it like there was no tomorrow. So there's power in your community. The other person that I want to tell you about is my husband, Tom, in that moment. Because, let's face it, women are made up a certain way, and that was now gone, and it was replaced with a bunch of scars. And not only that, he had a wife that looked like she had mange. Because I don't care what anyone says, all those pictures you see, the really beautiful white shining bald heads, It comes out in patches, and you have dark patches. So he has a wife that's full of scars, looks like she has mange, and is 50 pounds lighter than I am right now. And he never, ever looked at me like I was ugly. It never dawned on me that he saw me as ugly, because he didn't. And I later learned that while I was going through mine, he was going through his too. And he was on his knees constantly praying to the Lord, constantly asking God to see me through his eyes. And he did. And I felt it. I felt the love of God through my husband. I saw me through God's eyes, through him. He was my community. When I would sleep at night, I couldn't lay down. And I had a lounge chair that was next to me, or next to the bed. So there was Tom, there was me, and my 9-year-old decided there was her. So every night, it was the 3 of us laid out there. And in the middle of the night, I would wake up, and there's my 9-year-old right there. Hey, Molly. Every night, I would wake up, and she would have taken her blanket, and she would have laid it across me. Or she would have taken her stuffed animal, and she would have put it by my head. She would check on me through the night, and she would make sure that I was comfortable. And I would lay there, and I would hear her breathing. And it was soft, and it was steady, and it was smooth. And it would make me go to sleep. It was like lulling me into this beautiful sleep, and I could smell her because I had the stuffed animal right next to me. And in that moment, I saw God. She loved me so unconditionally in those moments, and she doesn't even probably remember that she did it. But she loved me so much in those moments to make sure that I wasn't cold, to make sure that I was comforted. And I saw how much God loved me. through a 9-year-old child. I had a 12-year-old that was my muscle. She did everything for me. I didn't ask. She just did. She was my muscle. And I saw God through that because he was my strength. God used the community around me to see him. I got to see pieces of who God was by the people he put into my life. And I can tell you that there was so much strength in that. The other part that I learned was the power of faith. Because you have those dark moments and you can spiral. You have your community, but at some point it becomes your faith. And I can tell you in those moments that it will either shake your faith or it will prove your faith. There's no middle ground when you go through the dark times. And so when I think about my faith, what is it that makes someone have more faith than another person? I mean, we all kind of want to go all over it. And I'm going to tell you right now, guys, I was not this person with this strong faith walk. I remember hearing how important it was to memorize before the incident, to grow closer to the Lord before something happens to you. And there is truth in that. Don't ever, ever discount that. There is truth in that. But I didn't memorize Bible verses. That just it wasn't who I was. So when I was in those moments, I couldn't read to you or come up off the top of my head Bible verses. But I did have a relationship with him. And I had enough of a relationship with him that when I was in those moments, I had enough foundation to know that if I called out to him, he would hear me. And in those moments, when you were like Peter, walking on the water, and then all of a sudden you're sinking, and Peter's hollering out, God, save me, that he does. And when those moments, when I would be on my knees going, God, be with me, save me, help me, he was. And I would feel him pulling me up. I had enough of that. I had enough to understand that. And so when the community came around side of me, and I had this piece going on inside of me, God completely surrounded me. And every time the enemy would come back after me, there were people around me that would pull me out. Whether it was family, pastors, friends, they would pull me out of those moments. And that was important to me. But I got to thinking, where is that line? Because there's a lot of people out there that have faith, but yet things can spiral and move. And it occurred to me when I was praying about this and thinking about it, it's not just having a relationship with Jesus. It's about having history with Jesus. You can have a relationship. I can have a relationship with Tom. I can have a relationship with Rick. I can have a relationship with Sebastian, but they're all going to be different because of the history I have with them. And when you look at people in the Bible like Abraham, let's be real. He was supposed to kill his son. God looked at him and said, sacrifice your son. Nobody in this room would have said, okay. If God asked me to sacrifice my girls, I couldn't do it. How could he do it? And then you look back on when Abraham first was introduced to us and the stories in the Bible. He told him to leave his land. God provided. He was in a famine. God provided. He sacrificed his wife to the emperor. God protected her. His son moves, or Lot, his nephew, moves to this horrific place. He gets taken. He's able to find him. God provided. God even walked up to him and allowed him to speak over Sodom and Gomorrah. He had history with God. He had been with God so long in his walk, he knew that God was always going to be with him. So when the time came that he said, sacrifice your son, Abraham said, okay, because he knew God would provide. It is that history that keeps us grounded with God. Everybody is in some spectrum. And I can tell you, I'm further along in that history than I was 11 years ago. But I had enough there that on top of my community and the faith that I did bring to the table got me through that season. We have to recognize the history we have with God. And you know how in the Bible he speaks about writing things down and how he always had the Israelites. I mean, the whole Bible is writing things down. And how the Israelites were to put up monuments is to remind us of our history. And we can easily forget it. And I can tell you how that played out for me. A few years later down the line, I lost my job. And at that point, I was the primary income maker provider for the family. That was a huge blow to us. But because of my history and because of how he answered me here, there was such peace in that moment. And it stayed with both my husband and I in that moment. And I was out of work for a year. I took a period of time off and then tried finding jobs. But God was always there and he provided because we had the history and because I learned back here what it feels like when God answers your prayers. You have to have history. The other part about faith is that it's a character issue. And I don't mean it's your character issue. I mean it's God's character issue. You either believe in his character or you don't. You either believe in his word or you don't. And those that come up, and even off of our own lips, we can hear things, yeah, but if he said it, it is real. We talk about us having to have faith in him, but he is always faithful to us. And we have to recognize that, and we have to move in that with the Lord for us to grow and to understand. The Bible speaks about being double-minded. And a lot of times that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. What does double-minded really mean? Because you have to be pragmatic in these situations. I can tell you, you can prepare for the worst and still not be double-minded. Or you can prepare for the worst and be very double-minded. It depends on where your heart is. We had the unique privilege of having a family that moved in with us because their daughter was suffering from cancer. She was 8 years old, 7 years old. She was very, very young. And I'm not saying that God did or didn't answer prayers. I'm saying that what happens to you when you go through these kind of situations is you begin to step back and you begin to watch how things happen. And you begin to see things you wouldn't have normally seen if you allow yourself to learn from what God's presented to you. And in those moments, I remember that we would talk about God healing her, God healing her, God healing her, and then she'd pick up the phone and call the funeral home to make arrangements. And I remember not thinking that she was doing, and please understand, I'm not saying that she caused it to happen because that is not the case at all. What I did see is it tearing her up. Because in the Bible where it talks about the waves throw you to and fro, and that's a double-minded person, that's what was happening to her. She was never able to ground herself in what she believed, because in one moment it was here, and then one moment it was there, and then one moment it was here, and it tore her up inside. And I saw the enemy slowly chip away, and to the point where she didn't have anything left. And it was because of being torn apart, being double-minded. And when God warns us about being double-minded, he's not saying I'm going to slap your hand if you don't think about it. He's saying I'm trying to protect your heart. Because when you're double-minded, you can't survive. You can't live. And that became very, very obvious to me. Another person was a lady that I was praying for that was diagnosed with breast cancer. And we were praying about it, and she was trying to decide whether she was going to do a lumpectomy or a mastectomy. And we were praying about it, and she had such confidence in it. And then she would say, yeah, but I have diabetes, so I can't have the surgery. And in my mind, I'm thinking, if you believe God can heal you here, can you have enough faith to believe that he'll heal you here? And I could see that it was making her bounce like this because she was double-minded. And when I say that, guys, we all do it. We all do it at times, but we have to recognize what we're doing because God cannot step into that place where we are so confused on our own accord to help build us up and to create the faith in us. So there is power in faith. You have to believe in God's character, and you have to understand that you need history with him. And history can come from you. It can come from the people that are around you. It can come from the things that you absorb. I can tell you that when I was going through that season, I listened to everything I could get my hands on. I had Bible verses written on cards, my favorite ones, posted all over the place. Now, I can't necessarily say that all of a sudden I was just like, yes, but I can tell you that every time the enemy came in, and every time he started messing with my head like a stupid song that would come on the radio about somebody dying. I remember one time being in the car driving to work, and a song came out. I can't even tell you what the song was. And my heart going, that's God telling me that I'm not going to be there for my kids. And then I remember, no, I'm not going to believe that. No, I'm not going to go there. And I could quote those Bible verses because I had them with me. They were the sword that came out of my mouth. And when God talks about putting yourself in the armor of God, there are very, very real, deliberate things. And the word is one of them. Now, I can't say that I'm like going, oh, and I'm going to be praying, and I'm going to be saying all of these words, and I'm going to be saying all these, but I can tell you in those moments when the enemy tried to pull me down, God's word would pull me right back up. And I was so thankful for the man that gave them to me, because I don't know if I had the energy myself to find them, but my community gave them to me. And it was interesting when my friend was going through that with her child. I remember opening the Bible, taking a Bible, and marking everywhere in it about healing. And I gave that Bible to her. Now, I don't know if she ever opened it or not. Looking back on it, I wish that I had marked everything about faith and hope. Because I think that when we are going through a tragedy, we move so much into the miracle piece of it, we don't recognize that it's God's relationship part of it that he's carrying us through to get us there. I remember I was talking to my friend of mine earlier this week, and she was telling me about a study that she did on prayer. And she was saying that when you pray, God hears all of your prayers. And God answers your prayers. He just doesn't answer them when you think he should or how you should. And there is a period between when you pray and when he answers that God is carrying you through a transition period. And if you don't allow that transition period, and if you don't believe in that transition period, you will never get here to understand the answer to your prayer. People live here, and they want the answer now. They pray, they want the answer. God didn't answer it. They pray, God didn't answer it. Not recognizing that this is a transitional period that he's giving you. And there is such a blessing in that transitional period that we have to grab onto and we have to understand and embrace. Because I can tell you that what got me through it was understanding the transition and allowing the transition and allowing his word and allowing his voice and allowing his example through other people to come into my life and transform me the way he wanted me transformed, not in the answer that I wanted down here. The last lesson I remember learning is that there's power in speaking out your testimony. And what you find, and those of you that have gone through things, you find that you have different words that come off of your lips when you speak to people that are going through something. I was in the midst of all of this. It was a year-long process. I went through the chemo, then I went into radiation. And in that period, I got septic in both breast cavities and was constantly on antibiotics. So this was a period that was very drawn out. And in the midst of that, my father got cancer. And my siblings and I got on a plane and went over to California to be with my dad. There was a boldness and a deliberateness in my language when I spoke to him that I would not have had otherwise. Because I could look into his eyes and I could see the fear because I got it. I'd been there. That gut-wrenching when you hear the C word of, and I laughingly call it the C word because it's a dirty word. No one wants to hear that. And I could see it in his eyes And so I had the ability to speak to him in a way that I never had before. And my father was not a man of faith. He listened. I was able to talk to him about the Lord. He said he believed in the Lord. Then my dad thought he got healed. And once he felt that he got healed and the doctor said he was clean, he walked away again. But it came back with a vengeance in a very short period of time. So I flew back out to see my dad again. And I remember when I got there, he had stopped talking. They had called hospice in. He was lying in the bed in the home, and he had stopped talking. And I was thinking, oh, God, I missed my opportunity. I missed my opportunity. I wanted to do the sinner's prayer. He had told me that he believed, but we never really went through the prayer. And, God, I missed my opportunity. And it was like I was getting eaten up inside because I wanted so desperately to talk to him about it. And for whatever reason, everybody had left the room except for my older sister and me. I grabbed my Bible. I grabbed her hand, went to one side. She went to the other. I opened it up, and in my blabbering, crying way, I read the sinner's prayer to him. Now, you got to remember, my dad wasn't responding at all anymore at this point. And when I read the sinner's prayer to him, I looked at him and I grabbed his hand and I said, Dad, do you believe? He shook his head yes, and he smiled and he whispered, I believe. Leah and I look at each other. We both start crying. We start saying the sinner's prayer again. My dad died a few days later. I believe I will see him when I go to heaven. I don't think I would have had that boldness had I not walked in the shadow of death myself. You also learn in your testimony when you're speaking to people when to speak and when to not. Because when you go through that season, you recognize that there are times that people are willing to hear, and there are times that they just need to be loved. And you begin to have a sensitivity for people that you would not otherwise have. So when I think about the ministry of one, and I say that it was birthed when I was in Ethiopia, it wasn't. It was birthed in that season. To understand, to look at and to see somebody and really see them and understand when they need a touch from God, and I may be the only touch they get. And learn when to close my mouth and when to open it. Those are the lessons I learned in my season. That there's power in the fear, but there's power in your faith. And you will be in a place in that moment where you can rise up or you can be torn down. And it's a personal choice and a journey that you go. Community is huge, and God intends for everything that we go through to have a testimony. Don't keep quiet about your testimonies. There are so many people that I know that have gone through something that have chosen to be silent about it and not speak about it. There's power in it. Power in your testimony. Everybody's broken. Everybody is going through something. And it's up to us to speak life into them. That's my story. Thank you.
Were there any dry eyes? Awesome testimony. She's right, and that's, we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. If we don't share what God's done, if I didn't learn things that God had done through other people, I wouldn't have known that it was even an option for me, because she did have a Baptist foundation. I had no foundation. I had a heathen foundation. So hearing anything was just mind-blowing to me that, that God does miracles. And so thank you for sharing. Can we give another hand clap? She's